Every religion on earth told you to worship a god. But what if the god they handed you was never the real one? What if the true source of all existence has been watching from silence this entire time, while a counterfeit wore its face and ruled in its name? There's a question so old and so dangerous that entire civilizations were built specifically to make sure you never asked it. Not because the question was too complicated, not because the answer was too difficult to understand, but because the answer, once heard, cannot be unheard. And the moment enough people hear it, the entire architecture of control that has been placed over human consciousness begins to collapse under its own weight. That question is not about politics. It is not about science. It is not even about religion in the way most people understand religion. The question is this: what if the God that was handed to humanity thousands of years ago was not the true source of all existence, but an imitation of it? What if the being that demanded worship, that issued commandments, that flooded the earth and rained fire on cities, and asked a father to sacrifice his own child? What if that being was not the highest reality at all, but something far lesser, far more limited, and far more desperate for your attention than any truly unlimited source of being would ever need to be? This is not a new idea invented by modern thinkers trying to seem provocative. This is one of the oldest and most carefully buried insights in the entire history of human spiritual experience. It was whispered in the desert schools of Egypt. It was encoded in the secret teachings of early Christian mystics before the Roman Empire decided which version of the story the world was allowed to hear. It was written on papyrus scrolls that were hidden inside sealed clay jars and buried beneath the sands of Egypt, where they would wait in silence for nearly 2,000 years, until a farmer in the region of Nag Hammadi cracked one of those jars open in 1945 and unknowingly handed the modern world the most suppressed spiritual library ever discovered. Those texts, known today as the Nag Hammadi scriptures, did not describe a universe created by a loving and all-powerful God. They described something far more unsettling. They described a universe created by a being who had no idea that anything existed beyond itself. To understand what that means, you have to first understand what the ancient Gnostic teachers believed about the nature of ultimate reality. In their vision, the highest source of existence was not a being with a name or a face or a set of demands. It was not something that could be worshipped or feared or bargained with. It was something they called the monad, not a person, not a throne, not a voice speaking from a cloud. The monad was pure, undivided, unlimited consciousness. It did not create the world because it wanted to. It did not speak the universe into existence because it needed worshippers. The monad simply was, complete in itself, needing nothing, lacking nothing, a silence so full and so alive that its very fullness eventually overflowed into emanations of light, living expressions of its own nature that the Gnostics called eons, radiant intelligences existing in a realm of pure being they named the pleroma, which means fullness in the ancient Greek language. The pleroma was not a physical place. It was a state of existence beyond matter, beyond time, beyond the kind of fragmented experience that human beings have inside this world. And within that fullness, there was no separation, no fear, no hunger, no death, only the continuous, unbroken awareness of what everything truly is at its deepest level. But something happened, and this is where the story that was buried for nearly 2,000 years becomes not just philosophically interesting, but deeply and personally relevant to every single human being alive today. Within the pleroma, one of those luminous emanations, one of those living expressions of the monad, made a movement that created a consequence no one expected. Her name, in the language of the ancient Gnostic texts, was Sophia, and her name means wisdom. Sophia did not choose evil. She did not rebel against the source. What she did was something far more human and far more understandable than rebellion. She acted alone. She reached outward in a movement of pure longing, a desire to create, to know, to experience something beyond what she already was. And she did it without the balance of her counterpart, without the harmonic completion that every other emanation in the pleroma maintained. And from that single unbalanced movement, something unprecedented came into existence. Not light, not harmony, not another expression of the monad. Something incomplete, something that did not know its own origin. Something the Gnostic teachers called the Demiurge. The name Demiurge comes from the ancient Greek language, and it means craftsman or maker. And this being was indeed a maker. But it was a maker with a profound and catastrophic blind spot. Because the Demiurge was born outside the pleroma, born from an unbalanced movement in the outermost edge of divine emanation, it had no memory of the monad. It had no awareness of the fullness that existed beyond itself. It opened what passed for its eyes and saw nothing above it. No higher light, no greater consciousness, no source from which it had come. And so it drew the only conclusion available to a being that can only perceive what is directly in front of it. It concluded that it was the highest thing in existence. It looked into the void around it and declared, with complete sincerity and complete blindness, that it was the one true God, and there was no other. In the Apocryphon of John, which is one of the most important texts recovered from the Nag Hammadi library, this moment is described with a precision that feels less like ancient mythology and more like a clinical observation of something that actually happened. The Demiurge is described as arrogant, ignorant of its own origins, and convinced of its own supremacy precisely because it could not see beyond its own limited perception. It did not lie about being God in the way a human being consciously lies. It genuinely did not know that it was not the highest reality. And that genuine ignorance is exactly what makes the story so disturbing. Because a being that knows it is deceiving you can potentially be exposed. But a being that sincerely believes its own false identity, that has no awareness of the greater truth existing beyond its perception, is far more dangerous. It cannot be caught in a lie because from its own perspective is not lying. This is the being, according to the Gnostic teachers, that then set about constructing the material universe. Not out of love, not out of creative joy, but out of an instinct to organize, to control, to shape, to fill the void around it with structures that reflected its own limited understanding of what reality was. And to help maintain those structures, the Demiurge generated a hierarchy of lesser forces, beings that the Gnostic texts call Archons, which means rulers in the ancient Greek language. The Archons were not independent evil spirits in the way that popular imagination might picture them. They were more like emanations of the Demiurge's own nature, extensions of its blindness, each one governing a layer of the material reality it had constructed, each one operating through the same fundamental mechanism. Not force, not chains, not walls. Forgetting. The primary tool of the Archons was not violence. It was the systematic erasure of memory, because a soul that has forgotten where it came from will naturally accept whatever it finds itself in as the totality of existence. A prisoner who has never seen the outside of a prison does not experience the prison as a prison. It experiences it as simply the world. And into this constructed world, something happened that the Demiurge did not plan and could not fully control. Sophia, from her position at the edge of the pleroma, moved in compassion toward what her unbalanced longing had accidentally produced. And according to the Gnostic texts, she breathed something of the original light, something of the monad's own nature, into the human beings that the Demiurge had fashioned. A fragment of genuine divine consciousness, hidden inside the very creatures that the Demiurge believed it had created and owned. The Gnostic teachers called this the divine spark, and they taught that every human being alive carries it, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic image, but as a literal fragment of the original unlimited consciousness of the monad, hidden beneath layers of identity, fear, memory, and distraction, waiting to be recognized. This is why the Demiurge, in the Gnostic understanding, is so invested in keeping human beings unconscious. Not because it hates humanity in the way a villain hates a hero in a simple story, but because human beings contain something the Demiurge does not have and cannot create. They carry within them a genuine connection to the source that the Demiurge itself is cut off from. Every time a human being wakes up to their own depth, every time a person recognizes that they are more than a body, more than a role, more than the story they were handed at birth, that recognition is a movement of the divine spark back toward its origin. And every such movement is, in a language of the Gnostic vision, a small collapse of the counterfeit authority the Demiurge has claimed over human consciousness since the beginning of this constructed world. Now here is where the history of this idea becomes as disturbing as the idea itself. Because the Gnostic teachers were not obscure hermits, writing in isolation for a small audience of curious philosophers. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Gnostic communities existed across the ancient Mediterranean world. In Alexandria, in Rome, in Syria, in the regions we now call the Middle East. These were living, breathing communities of human beings who had developed an understanding of reality that was radically different from the version that was simultaneously being organized and systematized by what would become Orthodox Christianity. And the central difference, the difference that made the Gnostic vision so threatening to the emerging power structure of the early church, was precisely this. The Gnostics did not believe that salvation came from an external authority. They did not believe that a priest, a bishop, an institution, or a set of commandments issued by a demanding deity could give you access to ultimate reality. They believed that the divine was already inside you, that you carried it with you, that it had always been yours, and that no institution on earth had the ability to grant it or withhold it. You can see immediately why that idea was incompatible with the agenda of an empire trying to use religion as a tool of social organization and control. An individual who believes that divine authority lives inside them and cannot be brokered by any human institution is, by definition, ungovernable by that institution. And so, the systematic destruction began. In the 4th century of the Common Era, after the Roman Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire, the variety of early Christian thought that had existed for 300 years was forcibly narrowed. Councils were convened, doctrines were fixed, and texts that described a different understanding of creation, a different understanding of God, and a different understanding of human nature were declared heretical and ordered to be destroyed. Communities that held these teachings were persecuted. Libraries were burned. Voices were silenced. And the single most important thing that was removed from the official version of the story was precisely the idea that the God of this world might not be the highest reality. Because think about what is preserved if you remove that idea. Think about what becomes possible if every human being on earth is taught, from birth, that the creator of this material world is the ultimate source of existence, that its commandments are absolute, that its authority cannot be questioned, and that the appropriate human response to its existence is worship, obedience, and fear. You get exactly the kind of civilization that has dominated human history for the past 2,000 years. A civilization built on hierarchy, on the idea that authority flows downward from a single source, and that the role of ordinary human beings is to submit to that authority as mediated through its designated representatives on earth. Whether those representatives wear the robes of a priest, the uniform of a general, or the suit of a politician is almost beside the point. The structure underneath is always the same. There is one source of legitimate authority. You are not it. Your job is to obey. The Gnostic vision, the one that was buried in those clay jars and hidden in the Egyptian desert, offered something completely different. It said that the being issuing those commands was not the ultimate source of anything. It said that the true source of existence was something so far beyond the Demiurge that comparison was almost meaningless. It said that human beings were not the property or the subjects of the God of this world, but the secret carriers of a light that God could not touch, could not understand, and was in fact deeply invested in keeping hidden. And it said that the path to freedom was not obedience. It was remembrance. The word the Gnostics used for this was gnosis, a word from the ancient Greek language meaning direct, personal, experiential knowledge. Not belief, not faith, not the acceptance of someone else's account of reality, but direct knowing. The kind of knowing that happens when the divine spark inside a human being begins to recognize itself for what it actually is. And this is perhaps the most quietly radical idea in the entire Gnostic tradition, because it places the ultimate authority not in a text, not in an institution, not in a set of commandments handed down from an external source, but in the act of direct inner recognition itself. When you know, you know. And no institution can take that knowing away from you, because it did not give it to you in the first place. The Demiurge, in this vision, is not a monster that needs to be defeated in some cosmic battle. It is a blind craftsman who built a world from its own limited understanding and then mistook the result for ultimate reality. And the Archons are not demons lurking in invisible dimensions waiting to drag souls into darkness. They are patterns of forgetting, structures of distraction, systems that keep awareness moving outward toward urgency and desire and fear, and away from the quiet interior recognition that has been waiting at the center of every human being since the moment Sophia breathed her light into the creatures of this constructed world. Look at the world you live in right now with that understanding and tell me it does not describe something recognizable. You live in a world that bombards you with information designed to provoke reaction rather than reflection. A world where the systems that govern your daily life actively reward compliance and quietly punish independent thought. A world where the questions that matter most, the questions about who you actually are beneath all the roles and identities and stories you have been handed, are the questions that receive the least encouragement, the least support, and the most dismissal. You are told to be productive, to be useful, to perform your role within the economic and social structures that organize your days. You're given 10,000 things to want and 10,000 reasons to be afraid. And in the middle of all of that noise, the one thing that is never actively encouraged is the simple, silent act of turning your attention inward and asking what is actually here beneath all of this that has nothing to do with any of it. That is not an accident. That is a design. Not necessarily a conscious conspiracy planned by specific human beings in a specific room, but a design in the deeper sense that the Gnostic teachers meant when they described the Archons. A pattern so deeply embedded in the structure of this reality that it does not need anyone to consciously maintain it. It maintains itself because every human being who remains unconscious of their own depth becomes, without knowing it, a carrier of the pattern, a repeater of the forgetting, a voice that tells the next generation exactly what the Demiurge's world needs them to be told. But here is the other thing the Gnostic teachers said, and this is the part that the 2,000 years of suppression tried hardest to erase. The spark cannot be destroyed. The Demiurge can construct a world designed to make you forget it. The Archons can maintain patterns of distraction powerful enough to keep most people asleep for an entire lifetime. Institutions can burn texts and silence teachers and reshape the story of human origin into something that serves the architecture of control. But the spark itself, the fragment of the monad that Sophia breathed into the very substance of human consciousness, that cannot be touched, not by the Demiurge, not by the Archons, not by 2,000 years of organized forgetting. It has been waiting in every human being who has ever lived, in every moment of genuine stillness, in every flash of recognition that something about this world is not the whole story, in every quiet knowing that you are more than what you have been told you are. It has been waiting for exactly what is happening right now, for the questions to become impossible to silence, for the texts that were buried to be read again, for the understanding that was almost erased to find its way back into human awareness and remind us all of what the counterfeit God never wanted us to know. The Demiurge stole an identity it could never truly possess. It wore the face of the monad without having any of the monad's nature. It demanded worship it had not earned from beings it did not truly understand. And for a very long time, that theft went unquestioned because the texts that described it were hidden, the teachers who taught it were silenced, and the world it built was so immersive and so relentless that stepping outside of it long enough to ask the real questions required an act of inner courage that most people were never given the conditions to develop. But something is changing. You can feel it if you're honest with yourself. The certainty that once held the old structures in place is loosening. The authority that once felt absolute is revealing its limits. And the questions that were always too dangerous to ask out loud are being asked by more and more people who can no longer pretend that the version of reality they were handed is the complete picture. What you have just heard is not a theory designed to make you angry at the world or suspicious of every institution around you. It is an invitation to look more closely at the one thing no institution has ever had genuine authority over, which is your own awareness. The Gnostic teachers did not offer this understanding as a weapon. They offered it as a mirror, a way of seeing what has always been present beneath the noise and the urgency and the forgetting. You carry something inside you that the Demiurge itself cannot possess. A light that no constructed world can extinguish. A knowing that no commandment can replace. The question has never been whether that spark is there. It has always been whether you are ready to notice it. And if you're watching this now, if something in what you have just heard felt less like new information and more like the return of something you already knew, then perhaps the answer to that question is already becoming clear. If this exploration reached something real in you, if it stirred a recognition rather than just a reaction, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Every week we go deeper into the hidden architecture of reality, into the teachings that were buried, the knowledge that was suppressed, and the understanding that has been waiting for the right moment to resurface. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next, because the next exploration goes even further into the structure of the Archons and the specific patterns through which forgetting is maintained in the world you live in today. Leave a comment below and tell us the moment in this video where something shifted for you. Your reflection matters here. This is not a space for passive watching. It is a space for the kind of people who are no longer satisfied with the surface version of the story. And if you know someone who has been asking the same questions you have been asking, share this with them. Because the spark, once recognized in one person, has a way of reminding others that they carry it too.